Likewise, joining us, Miranda, Terry Jeffrey, the editor-in-chief of CNSnews.com. Terry, a new Congress in what here, about less than 25 minutes, but who's counting? What do you make of the changes in the Senate? Will it be as magnanimous as Rand Paul has outlined?
No, but I do think it's a good idea to let senators bring up amendments, JD. I remember when I first started covering the Senate back in the 1980s, I used to go down and sit in the press gallery above the chamber and watch Jesse Helms do his work. And in those days, Jesse Helms used to routinely force senators to take a stand on fundamental issues that others in the chamber did not want to deal with. They did not want to take a yes or no vote. He would make them do it. He drove issues like the National Endowment for the Arts funding, for example, into the national debate. So I think it's a good thing, and I'm glad Senator McConnell's going to do that.
Terry, so the question we've been asking everybody all day, what everybody wants to know, will House Speaker John Boehner survive the challenge to his speakership?
Yeah, well, I'm not counting votes down there. I suspect he will. He needs 29 to not win on the first ballot. He lost 12 2 years ago and only got 220 votes, so he got only 2 more than he needed 2 years ago. I think the fact that you have conservatives rebelling against him is important and significant. I doubt that he's actually going to lose the vote, however.
Well, Terry, one of the primary criticisms by so many on the right was the decision to go ahead and fund the government on through till September, with the exception of Homeland Security and immigration, which will come up in a couple of months. But a lot of people are saying you even fund the president's executive amnesty for a couple of months, it'll get locked in. Is Boehner one of the pro-amnesty guys, and is that the fundamental rift at work within the Republican caucus or conference?
Yeah, I mean, JD, absolutely. I think that Omnibus bill was a deal that was cut between Obama, Harry Reid, and John Boehner and the Republican leaders in the House. It was their bill. You had 67 conservatives in the House vote against it. They cast the right vote. That it not only funded that illegal, unilateral, unconstitutional amnesty through February 27th, at least, it funded Planned Parenthood. It funded the attack on religious liberty we've seen in the Obamacare regulation. It funded literally everything else Obama is doing. So it was an outrage. I think it's wrong for John Boehner not to take a stand and fight the president on these things. I think if the Republican leadership in the House would take a stand and would fight Obama, they could win the national debate, but they don't want to do it.
So you don't think they're going to tackle amnesty in the new Congress?
You know, I'm worried they'll go the other way. What I'm worried will happen is that they'll come up with some other piece of immigration legislation that puts some kind of nominal increase in security at the border that really won't stop illegal immigration. In exchange for that, they will actually enact Obama's amnesty in legislation. That's what I'm worried will happen, that the Republicans will take credit along with Obama for doing the amnesty.
And this leads to suspicions. 30 seconds left, Terry. The establishment in Washington, whether Republican or Democratic, working in collusion, kind of a toxic form of bipartisanship. You get the last word with 30 seconds remaining.
There's absolutely no doubt about it, JD. You know, I did a piece about a month ago about how the debt has gone up $3.8 trillion in the 3.8 years John Boehner was Speaker. That's $1 trillion a year in debt under John Boehner, a Republican Speaker.
And it is a topic we will continue. Terry, we're going to ask you to hang around. We will come back after the break because it's a lengthy agenda and there's a long list of grievances. Yes. More with Terry Jeffrey and you. Stay tuned here to America's Forum on Newsmax TV. To continue our conversation with Terry Jeffrey there would be just outside Washington, D.C., in that snowy environment there in the nation's capital. Terry is the editor-in-chief of CNS News, in addition to being a nationally syndicated columnist. So, Terry, 53 political prisoners supposed to be out in exchange for diplomatic relations. Looks like the Castro brothers have pulled one over on the president, or did they?
Well, you know, that's a good question. I thought the most troubling thing when President Obama came out and announced he was going to renew diplomatic relations with Cuba was the moral equivalence in his speech. In fact, there were things in there where his tone and his language suggested that he thought The United States was at fault with the nature of our relationship with Cuba for the last 5 decades. When in fact, if you look at the State Department's own human rights report on Cuba, it says that the State Department, Obama's State Department, says Cuba is an authoritarian regime run by the Communist Party. Everybody that is in the government of Cuba is either a member of the Communist Party or has been approved by the Communist Party. There is no freedom in Cuba. Cuba is what the Soviet Union was before 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. And President Obama doesn't seem to have the same sort of distrust and wariness about a communist regime that American presidents in the past have had. And quite frankly, I think that's because to a certain degree, President Obama has an empathy for the sort of Marxism that the Castro brothers have advanced in Cuba.
Well, Terry, having said that, presidential hopeful Rand Paul said he agreed with Obama's decision to do this. Will that hurt him for 2016?
It could, but let me say this. Having said what I just said, I do not believe having diplomatic relations with Cuba is necessarily a mistake. I think that when we didn't have diplomatic relations, for example, with Saddam Hussein's Iraq, we did not know what was going on inside Iraq. Same when we didn't have diplomatic relations with Muammar Gaddafi's Libya. Muammar Gaddafi was an evil man. Saddam Hussein was an evil man. They ran evil regimes. But that doesn't necessarily mean the United States shouldn't have diplomatic relations. During the Cold War, the United States had diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. We had diplomatic relations with Stalin's Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan met with Mikhail Gorbachev, even though Mikhail Gorbachev was the communist dictator of the Soviet Union. So diplomatic relations is one thing, moral equivalence is another, and the sanctions and the way we treat Cuba other than diplomatic relations ought to be based on the reality of the regime rather than some sort of fantasy we have about it.
Well, let me bring, for lack of a better term, diplomatic relations back domestically. Do you think this president will speak as glowingly of the Republican majorities in the House and Senate with the start of this new Congress as he does about the Castro brothers, for example? Will we see? We've been hearing the president's going to reconcile. 30 seconds. Do you think that's going to happen here?
Well, I think that John Boehner and Mitch McConnell have signaled that they want to do business with President Obama. So personally, I think that's bad for the whole country. To the degree that they agree on things, it's bad. JD, we already have a massive government moving towards $4 trillion in spending. We ran up the debt more than $700 billion last year. We need a Congress that resists big government, and that means resisting President Obama.
Terry Jeffrey, editor-in-chief of CNS News and nationally syndicated columnist. As always, Terry, we appreciate your time. Now, don't go away. Some more interesting topics to discuss before we take our leave here on America's Forum.